At 5 a.m., before the heat rises over Ouagadougou, a line of machines stands still in the half-light. Engines quiet, steel resting against soil that has seen empires come and go. Somewhere in a government office, a number sits on paper, 1,000 billion CFA francs. Somewhere else, a repayment timeline stretches beyond 50 years, longer than most political careers, longer than most memories. And in the middle of that gap between steel and spreadsheets, a decision was made. Why would a country under security pressure refuse what the global system calls normal financing? Why question a structure that almost every developing nation has accepted without protest? And who is doing all this? Let's find out. The argument did not begin with ideology. It began with arithmetic. On paper, the Faso-Mabogo Highway looked like a standard infrastructure proposal. A multi-lane corridor designed to improve connectivity, reduce transport time, stimulate trade flows, and integrate internal markets. Every economist could explain their logic. Roads reduce friction. Reduced friction increases economic velocity. Increased velocity expands tax bases. On the surface, nothing controversial. But beneath the surface sat the figure. Over 1,000 billion CFA francs under the externally structured model. And beneath that figure sat the timeline. Repayment structures stretching toward half a century. Now pause. 50 years is not a budget line. It is a generational sentence. It means that a student currently in secondary school would enter adulthood, build a career, perhaps raise children, all while the state continues servicing installments on a single corridor of asphalt negotiated long before they voted. That is where the discomfort began. Because highways do not last 50 years without maintenance cycles, upgrades, resurfacing, and design adjustments. Technology changes, transport density shifts, climate conditions evolve. The idea of repaying a project over half a century raises a quiet question. Are we financing development or financing a permanent debt? This is not an emotional argument. It is structural. Long-term sovereign loans redistribute risk into the future. They provide immediate capital but constrain future maneuverability. When repayment consumes fiscal space, governments become cautious. Budgets narrow. Strategic flexibility declines. Policy innovation shrinks because debt servicing has priority. For decades, this arrangement has been normalized across the developing world. Borrowing for infrastructure is presented as maturity. Refusal is presented as recklessness. But what if the reckless move is not questioning the debt, but assuming it must be accepted? When Ibrahim Traoré publicly challenged the highway's cost structure, he did not argue against roads. He argued against inevitability. He reframed the conversation from, can we afford to build, to, can we afford the structure under which we are building? And that reframing matters. Because infrastructure financing is not just about capital availability. It is about leverage distribution. It is about who absorbs overruns. It is about who captures margins. It is about whether a country's future tax base becomes collateral for present convenience. Burkina Faso is not among Africa's wealthiest states. It operates under security strain. Its fiscal environment is tight. Under those conditions, locking in multi-decade repayment cycles carries amplified consequences. The question then becomes brutally simple. Is development defined by how quickly you build or by how freely you can act afterward? When the math stopped making sense, the conversation stopped being technical. It became strategic. And once a country begins treating financing as a strategy rather than routine, the ground shifts. Because if this number could be questioned, what else could be questioned? Large infrastructure offers arrive wrapped in layers: feasibility studies, traffic projections, engineering assessments, environmental impact reports, financial models, and repayment schedules. Each document looks rational on its own. Together, they form something bigger, an architecture. That architecture is global. Across the developing world, the infrastructure template is familiar. External consultants conduct assessments. International contractors bid for execution, and sovereign guarantees back the financing. Repayment is distributed over decades. Interest reflects risk ratings shaped by global credit agencies. The entire process fits neatly into a system designed for predictability. Predictability is attractive. Predictability reassures lenders. predictability reassures investors. Predictability reassures international markets. But predictability can also lock countries into patterns that are difficult to escape. When institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank participate in broader macroeconomic frameworks, their role is to stabilize and discipline fiscal behavior. Their logic prioritizes systemic balance. That is their function within the global financial order. Yet the global financial order was not designed around maximum sovereignty for small states. It was designed around stability for the system as a whole. That distinction matters, because under the traditional infrastructure model, technical control and financial leverage often sit outside the borrowing country. Even when projects succeed, a large portion of high-value engineering margins, procurement contracts, and financial returns circulate internationally rather than internally. The borrowing state gains the asset, the road, the bridge, the port, but it may not capture the full ecosystem of technical growth around it. That ecosystem includes advanced project management skills, procurement control, machinery maintenance networks, industrial spillovers, and financial engineering expertise. If those layers remain external, then infrastructure becomes consumption rather than capability expansion. This is the subtle layer that often escapes public debate. When Burkina Faso examined the highway proposal, the question was not only, can we pay this? It was also, who truly benefits from the structure? Under externally financed turnkey contracts, risk is distributed in ways that protect contractors first and sovereigns later. If delays occur, renegotiations often extend timelines. If costs escalate, repayment adjusts. Interest does not pause. Rejecting that architecture does not mean rejecting global engagement. It means refusing to accept one model as destiny. The moment a country questions the financing structure rather than simply the price, it shifts from being a client to being a negotiator. That shift is uncomfortable for established systems because it introduces unpredictability. And unpredictability, in finance, is treated as instability. But unpredictability, in sovereignty, can be treated as agency. So when Burkina Faso signaled hesitation toward a standard infrastructure architecture, it was not merely pushing back on a loan, it was interrogating a pattern. And interrogating patterns often leads to something riskier and potentially more transformative. What happens when a country decides to carry the operational weight itself instead of outsourcing it to the architecture of predictability? The answer to that question is not theoretical. It is physical. It is heavy machinery rolling before sunrise. It is procurement meetings held in government offices instead of foreign boardrooms. It is engineers arguing over soil density under Sahel heat rather than consultants presenting polished renderings on screens thousands of miles away. When Burkina Faso signaled that it would pursue the Faso-Mabogo highway through domestic mobilization rather than defaulting to the turnkey external financing structure, something subtle but significant happened. The weight moved inward. Instead of distributing the financial burden across 5 decades, the country absorbed the operational burden immediately. An operational burden is unforgiving. It demands coordination. It demands discipline. It demands efficiency in ways that debt contracts often obscure. If a foreign contractor builds your road under a sovereign loan, the immediate stress sits on the balance sheet. The repayment clock ticks quietly in the background, while the physical execution unfolds externally. The state supervises. It does not strain. But if the state mobilizes equipment, manages logistics, oversees engineers, and compresses timelines internally, the stress is visible. Every delay is local. Every miscalculation echoes domestically. Every success, however, compounds internally as well. This is where the experiment becomes bold, because domestic execution is not simply about pride, it is about skill accumulation. Infrastructure projects are classrooms disguised as construction sites. They generate managerial capacity, procurement networks, maintenance ecosystems, and technical confidence. If these capacities remain externalized, the country builds roads but not capability. If they are internalized, even imperfectly, the country builds both, and capability compounds faster than interest. The reported deployment of over 100 heavy machines across the phases of construction was not just an operational detail. It was a signal of scale. Coordinating that scale locally requires institutional muscle. It requires supply chain synchronization. It requires internal accountability. That kind of pressure reshapes bureaucracies. It forces ministries to operate with urgency rather than routine pacing. It exposes inefficiencies quickly. It eliminates the luxury of hiding behind external contractors. This is not romantic. It is intense, because when the weight moves inward, excuses disappear. If the timeline slips, there is no foreign project manager to blame. If costs inflate, the scrutiny is domestic. If the machinery idles, the question is internal. That accountability is dangerous but powerful. It transforms development from an outsourced activity into a national responsibility. And here lies the psychological shift. For decades, large-scale infrastructure in many African countries has felt imported, financed elsewhere, designed elsewhere, and executed elsewhere. Citizens watched but did not own the process. Domestic mobilization changes that perception. When local engineers manage complexity, when local logistics networks synchronize equipment and labor, when local institutions compress deadlines, something intangible strengthens. Confidence. Confidence is not measured in GDP, but it influences GDP. Because nations that believe they can execute complex systems begin to attempt more complex systems. Yet confidence alone cannot sustain roads. Execution must meet expectations. So the question becomes sharper now. Can domestic discipline match the ambition that moved the weight inward? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The answer to whether domestic discipline can match ambition does not lie in speeches. It lies in systems. Once the weight moves inward, rhetoric becomes irrelevant. What matters is procurement efficiency, cost-tracking precision, machinery uptime ratios, fuel logistics, supply chain resilience, and site management discipline. Infrastructure is unforgiving mathematics applied to dirt. This is where many bold political gestures fail. Ambition outruns administration. Vision outruns systems. If Burkina Faso's internal mobilization is to mean anything, it must avoid the traps that critics are waiting to point at. Inflated internal contracts, opaque accounting, maintenance neglect, and timeline slippage disguised as strategic adjustment. Because here is the harsh reality. When you reject a familiar financing structure, you inherit the full burden of proof. There is no buffer. Under traditional sovereign loan models, delays can be renegotiated. Terms can be restructured. Repayment schedules can be extended. International financial frameworks provide breathing room, often at a cost, but breathing room nonetheless. Domestic mobilization removes that cushion. If procurement misfires, there is no external partner to absorb the reputational shock. If cost transparency falters, trust erodes quickly. If corruption infiltrates the process, critics will not hesitate to say the old model was safer. And that is precisely why discipline becomes existential. This is no longer about whether a road gets built. It is about whether a new financing posture can survive its first stress test. Burkina Faso operates under security pressure. Border instability consumes resources. Fiscal space is limited. Under these conditions, misallocation is amplified. Every misstep is magnified. So what must hold? First, cost clarity. The public must understand how funds are allocated, not in abstract totals, but in breakdowns that show materials, labor, machinery acquisition, and maintenance forecasts. Transparency is armor. Second, institutional coordination. Ministries cannot operate in silos. Transport, finance, security, procurement, they must synchronize, or friction will consume momentum. Third, maintenance planning. Roads are not single events, they are long-term obligations. If maintenance budgets are not integrated into the planning phase, the symbolic victory collapses into recurring repair cycles. Fourth, technical training pipelines. If domestic execution is the strategy, then human capital must scale with it. Engineers, project managers, and logistics specialists, their development determines sustainability. This is where belief either hardens into capability or dissolves into disappointment. The experiment is bold precisely because it exposes the state fully. And exposure is uncomfortable, but exposure also accelerates institutional maturity, if handled correctly. If Burkina Faso can demonstrate disciplined execution under fiscal and security strain, the implications extend beyond one highway. It proves that operational risk can be managed internally without defaulting to generational financial commitments. But if discipline fractures, critics will argue that sovereignty without structure is chaos. So the pressure is not ideological, it is technical. And the next question becomes unavoidable. If discipline holds and the road stands, what does that do to the continental narrative that borrowing is the only serious path forward? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If discipline holds and the road stands, something far larger than asphalt shifts. Because once a single, inevitable structure is proven negotiable, others begin to look less permanent. For decades, infrastructure borrowing has been treated as maturity. Credit ratings, sovereign bond issuances, and multilateral packages were presented as signs that a country had entered the adult table of global economics. Debt was not weakness, it was participation. But participation under unequal leverage is still asymmetrical. If Burkina Faso can demonstrate that a large-scale infrastructure corridor can be executed with reduced exposure to multi-decade repayment structures, it does not abolish global finance. It reframes the conversation. It introduces optionality, and optionality is power. Optionality means a government can approach lenders with negotiation strength rather than assumption. It means partnerships become choices instead of necessities. It means timelines are debated, not absorbed. Imagine the ripple. In Nigeria, with its vast internal market and oil revenues, why must every major corridor depend on heavy external structuring? In Kenya, with its logistics positioning and technological base, why should repayment horizons automatically stretch beyond political generations? In Ghana or Senegal, with growing financial sectors, why not explore deeper domestic capital mobilization before defaulting outward? The point is not isolation. The point is leverage. Young Africans understand leverage instinctively. They trade in digital markets. They understand borrowing against assets. They understand the difference between strategic debt and suffocating debt. And they also understand that sovereignty is not measured by flags or speeches, but by who controls fiscal breathing space. If Burkina Faso reduces long-term financial gravity while maintaining execution standards, it introduces a different developmental rhythm, one less defined by distant repayment clocks. That rhythm matters, because when budgets are not constrained by heavy legacy obligations, governments can redirect funds toward industrial policy, research institutions, energy grids, technological infrastructure, and security stabilization without constantly calculating interest exposure. And this is where the deeper shift emerges. Africa has often been described as rising in cycles, commodity booms followed by debt corrections, followed by austerity adjustments, followed by growth spurts, followed by fiscal tightening. A pendulum. What if the pendulum is not inevitable? What if structural discipline combined with selective engagement smooths the swing? The Faso-Mabogo Highway is not large enough to transform continental finance on its own, but it can do something more disruptive. It can puncture psychological inevitability. Once inevitability weakens, creativity strengthens. Policymakers begin asking different questions. Economists begin modeling alternative financing structures. Domestic pension funds and capital markets become more central. Public-private models are renegotiated. Regional blocs consider cooperative infrastructure funding. None of this requires hostility toward global partners. It requires confidence in domestic negotiation power. And that confidence, if validated, spreads. But here's the sharper edge of the question. If this road holds structurally and financially, what other systems, long accepted as immovable, suddenly look like they can be redesigned? If the road holds, what truly changes is not traffic flow. It is a trajectory. Because once a nation proves, even once, that it can execute a major infrastructure corridor without locking itself into generational financial gravity, the internal horizon shifts. Planning becomes more assertive. Industrial policy becomes less apologetic. Negotiation posture becomes firmer. The Faso-Mabogo Highway is not just a transport link. It is a stress test of development philosophy. If it stands, structurally sound, cost-contained, operationally disciplined, it demonstrates that operational risk can be absorbed without surrendering fiscal decades in advance. It proves that sovereignty in financing is not a fantasy. It becomes precedent. Precedent becomes bargaining power. When future infrastructure proposals arrive, the conversation changes. Instead of accepting repayment structures as fixed, Burkina Faso and potentially others can say, "We have alternatives." That sentence alone alters leverage dynamics, and leverage is the quiet currency of geopolitics. But the deeper transformation is internal. Young engineers who manage procurement cycles under pressure do not return to passivity. Civil servants who coordinated machinery fleets under tight timelines do not forget that capability. Universities observing domestic execution recalibrate their training priorities. Technical institutes expand focus. Private sector actors recognize opportunity in maintenance networks and logistics chains. Confidence compounds. That compounding is subtle at first. It shows up in budget debates that assume domestic mobilization is viable. It shows up in future projects designed with internal coordination at the center rather than external oversight at the helm. It shows up in negotiations where African officials ask sharper questions, demand clearer cost structures, and shorten repayment horizons. None of this abolishes partnership. It rebalances it. Africa does not need isolation. It needs leverage symmetry. If this highway becomes proof of concept, it weakens a narrative that has persisted quietly for decades, that African development must always be externally underwritten. That narrative is powerful because it shapes expectation. Expectation shapes policy. Policy shapes outcomes. Break the expectation and policy space expands. Of course, the opposite remains true. If discipline fractures, if costs inflate beyond justification, if transparency erodes, critics will say the old model was safer. They will argue that domestic mobilization without structural reform invites inefficiency. That is why execution remains everything. But imagine for a moment that 5 years from now, trucks move smoothly along a durable corridor built without multi-decade external financial gravity. Imagine transport costs dropping. Regional trade is increasing. Maintenance is funded sustainably. Youth pointing to the road and saying, "We did that." That sentence matters. Not because it flatters pride, because it recalibrates possibility. The future of African geopolitics will not be determined by slogans. It will be shaped by whether nations can translate sovereignty rhetoric into operational systems. The Faso-Mabogo Highway is one attempt. If it succeeds, the conversation about inevitability shifts permanently. And when inevitability dissolves, imagination becomes policy. The road then becomes more than infrastructure. It becomes evident that Africa can choose its own financing rhythm and survive it. So, let us know in the comments section. Did Traore do the right thing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.